However, sometimes the Rhine dwellers got even. Cockfighting was among the amusements enjoyed by young men of all classes in the 90s. Cornell fraternities had cock runs adjacent to their houses stocked with imported French birds. Fights were staged at various locations, including the basement of the Ezra Cornell Mansion, Lenrock. Ezra's grandson, young Charlie Blair, was very much the model of a sporting gent of his era. His parents had the 19th century equivalent of a divorce. Mrs. Blair and her children lived with her mother and sisters in the family mansion, and her husband practiced law in New York City. Young Charlie grew up and entered the university. Apparently, he and his friends sought a larger venue than the campus or Charlie's basement offered for staging fights. Charlie's uncle had built a canning factory in the West End, and the business had failed, as so many Cornell family businesses did. Charlie obtained the keys to the building and invited the Rhiners and his Cornell crowd to a major event with birds from both groups competing. Amid the fumes of kerosene lanterns, cigar smoke, chickens, unwashed people, and alcohol, the excitement peaked and the bets were passed. Then someone ran in the door shouting that a squad of police was on their way. Someone else blew out the lamps. People and birds fled out windows and doors. It is said that gowned professors as well as students were seen swimming and wading the icy inlet that March night to avoid the embarrassment of facing gambling charges. However, it is also said that the cry of raid was staged and that several of the Rhiners lingered to gather up both the cash and the best of the surviving cocks. It is further said that these aristocratic birds were kidnapped not for the cooking pots of the Rhine, but to improve the local breed, and that their descendants fought on for many years. The losers, though, were definitely destined for soup. The first automobile arrived in Ithaca at the beginning of the 20th century and offered new opportunities for being bad. When the roads permitted, people could drive around the region and sample the offerings of the rural taverns and roadhouses. Prohibition was voted into law between 1920 and 1933, but clandestine drinking at out-of-sight locations continued. Some of these places, begun as early as roadside inns in the early 19th century, have survived and most recently been recognized as offering badness in one of its most modern forms, lap dancing. The 20th century brought some newcomers to Ithaca. Renwick Park had fallen out of fashion and was leased by the Horton brothers, movie makers. They came to town with their cameras and actors, hired some locals, and staged as much wickedness as they dared, though in the films, badness was always punished and the virtuous rewarded. One of the more interesting characters off the set was Pearl White. Among other things, she annoyed local law enforcement by driving too fast while smoking cigars. Other arrivals in the teens were associated with the Thomas Morse Aircraft Company. Tex Marshall was a test pilot. When he wasn't driving an open car, he was contending with something like this. The Glenwood Hotel was very much the place to go in the teens and into the Prohibition era of the 20s. It offered drinks and dancing and canoe rentals to the sophisticated crowd who came from Ithaca by way of the Busy Bee Ferry or the longer way by auto. In the early 20th century, young gentlemen were expected to marry the mothers of their children. Hazel Krantz may have been an inconvenience to the wealthy student she was seeing. They left the dance floor at Glenwood for a moonlight canoe ride. The canoe overturned and she drowned. Donald Feathers offered an unlikely explanation of how he happened to have removed his pants after falling into the water while keeping his shoes on, and he was charged with her murder. But when her body could not be found, he was released. Oddly enough, his brother was involved in a similar crime or accident in another state. In the 20s and 30s, fairs still offered their attractions, including the opportunity to view young women in fewer clothes than acceptable for everyday wear. Zoftig was the favored style of beauty. The 1940s brought a new generation of pilots and mechanics to train at Ithaca's airport, which was still on the west side of the lake. And the 40s brought employment and introduced the office party. Music was still to be had in ample variety in Ithaca. While sailboats still had their adherents, powerboats were exciting and were thought to require less skill and sobriety to manage. Students still arrived in Ithaca by train, especially on special weekends. It is said that the railroad would bring in extra passenger cars at the beginning of a weekend and leave them on a siding for a night or two. These cars, with their sleeping berths, could be accessed by student couples seeking a level of privacy not to be found in the strictly chaperoned dormitories and boarding houses of the town. However, to avoid embarrassment and a hasty clothes-in-hand leap off the train, one had to be awake and out early in the morning. Horse racing had declined, though not entirely disappeared by the middle of the 20th century. Automobiles were more appealing to the wilder young men of that era. Cornell was the featured site for several novels of the time, of varying quality and memorability, and featuring a certain amount of badness. The 50s were followed by the 60s and the 70s, and there is too much to tell about those eras for this evening. The addition of drug culture to alcohol culture, with the new faith in antibiotics and contraception, brought significant changes to definitions of good and bad behavior. The favorite band leader of this time was Bernie Milton, and there are a lot of us who remember dancing to him on State Street during Ithaca festivals. The 1970s farmers market had to move because some of the nearby business owners said they thought that the vendors' naked small children presented a health hazard. However, the 1960s were far more complicated than sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was an era fraught with serious, soul-searched moral choices in many areas. Many of us sought to combine the seriousness of vision of a Wisner with the easygoing fun of the West Enders. And by the 20th century, this was the appearance of the block where Wisner first preached, in a barn said to be even more dilapidated than this one. Most of the buildings that were the Rhine went away in the 1935 flood. And by that time, the property ownership was changing and values, and I don't think most people were allowed to rebuild. I've heard that some of the shacks stayed out on the area that's now Newman Golf Course for the longest period, that they were among the last to be removed. That was where this city dump was, and that there were some there. And I've heard that if you cross the highway from Cass Park and walk over towards the hillside where the old railroad tracks were, you'll find some foundations that were part of Rhine housing, but I've never gone to look for them there. The inlet itself has moved, so the places, the sites that they are on are completely obliterated and changed. I mean, there were respectable neighborhoods there and the Rhine neighborhood, and all of that has completely been rebuilt and reconfigured.